Hello to you all. In the previous video, we finished up by looking at the different subject positions involved in the photographic process. So we were looking at being the photographer or the operator, being the subject of the photograph or the target, and then being the spectator. So I want to develop that a bit further by going to this fabulous little book called Camera Lucida by Roland Barthes, which is filled with wonderful analysis, his own kind of personal thoughts about the photographic process and what it means to him. But there are so many sort of nuggets of gold in this book. It's a fabulous book to read on the beach. It's only about 120 pages long. But let's just go there now and see what he has to say here. So he says, I make myself the measure of photographic knowledge. What does my body know of photography? I observe that a photograph can be the object of three practices, or of three emotions, or of three intentions: to do, to undergo, to look. So the operator is the photographer, the spectator is ourselves, all of us who glance through collections of photographs in magazines, newspapers, whatever. And the personal thing photographed is the target, the referent, a kind of little simulacrum, any eidolon, which is an idealized person, emitted by the object, which I should like to call the spectrum of the photograph, because this word retains, through its root, a relation to spectacle, and adds to it that rather terrible thing which is there in every photograph, the return of the dead. So, chapter 5 here. It can happen that I am observed without knowing it. And again, I cannot speak of this experience since I'm determined to be guided by the consciousness of my feelings. But very often, too often to my taste, I've been photographed and knew it. Now, once I feel myself observed by the lens, everything changes. I constitute myself in the process of posing. I instantaneously make another body for myself. I transform myself in advance into an image. And this transformation is an active one. I feel that the photograph creates my body or mortifies it, according to its caprice. Apology of this mortiferous power. Certain communards, these were the 1870 rebels who took over Paris in what was known as the Paris Commune. Certain communards paid with their lives for their willingness or even their eagerness to pose on the barricades. Defeated, they were recognized by Thiers police and shot, almost everyone. Posing in front of the lens, I mean, knowing I'm posing even fleetingly, I do not risk so much as that, at least not for the moment. No doubt it is metaphorically that I derive my existence from the photographer. But though this dependence is an imaginary one, and from the purest image repertoire, I experience it with the anguish of an uncertain filiation or relationship. An image, my image, will be generated. Will I be born from an antipathetic individual or from a good sort? If only I could come out on paper as on classical canvas, endowed with a noble expression, thoughtful, intelligent, etc. In short, if I could be painted by Titian or drawn by Clouet. But since what I want to have captured is a delicate moral texture and not a mimicry, and since photography is anything but subtle, except in the hands of the very greatest portraitists, I don't know how to work upon my skin from within. I decide to let drift over my lips and in my eyes a faint smile which I mean to be indefinable, in which I might suggest, along with the qualities of my nature, my amused consciousness of the whole photographic ritual. I lend myself to the social game. I pose. I know I'm posing. I want you to know that I'm posing. But to square the circle, this additional message must in no way alter the precious essence of my individuality, what I am apart from any effigy. What I want, in short, is that my mobile image, buffeted along 1,000 shifting photographs, altering with situation and age, should always coincide with my profound self. But it is the contrary that must be said. Myself never coincides with my image, for it is the image which is heavy, motionless, stubborn, which is why society sustains it, and myself, which is light divided, dispersed, like a bottle imp, myself doesn't hold still, giggling in my jar. If only photography could give me a neutral, anatomic body, a body which signifies nothing. Alas, I'm doomed by well-meaning photography always to have an expression. My body never finds its 0 degree. No one can give it to me, perhaps only my mother. For it is not indifference which erases the weight of the image. The photomat always turns you into a criminal type, wanted by the police, but love, extreme love. A few lines down on the left-hand column here. For the photograph is the advent of myself as other, a cunning dissociation of consciousness from identity. Next page. This disturbance is ultimately one of ownership. Law has expressed it in its way. To whom does the photograph belong? Its landscape itself only a kind of loan made by the owner of the terrain? Countless cases apparently have expressed this uncertainty in a society for which being was based on having. Photography transformed subject into object, and even one might say into a museum object. In order to take the first portraits around 1840, the subject had to assume long poses under a glass roof in bright sunlight. To become an object made one suffer as much as a surgical operation. And then a device was invented, a kind of prosthesis invisible to the lens, which supported and maintained the body in its passage to immobility. And this headrest was the pedestal of the statue I would become, the corset of my imaginary essence. The portrait photograph is a closed field of forces. 4 image repertoires intersect here, oppose and distort each other. In front of the lens, I am at the same time the one I think I am, the one I want others to think I am, the one the photographer thinks I am, and the one he makes use of to exhibit his art. In other words, a strange action. I do not stop imitating myself, and because of this, each time I am, or let myself be, photographed, I invariably suffer from a sensation of inauthenticity, sometimes of imposture, comparable to certain nightmares. In terms of image repertoire, the photograph, the one I intend, represents that very subtle moment when, to tell the truth, I'm neither subject nor object, but a subject who feels he's becoming an object. That's brilliant. I think that's brilliant. That if you've ever felt icky in front of a camera lens, it's probably that. Just what he said there. And I then experience a kind of micro version of death. I'm truly becoming a spectre. And the photographer knows this very well, and himself fears, if only for commercial reasons, this death in which his gesture will embalm me. Nothing would be funnier if one were not its passive victim, as Sade would say, than the photographer's contortions to produce effects that are lifelike, wretched notions. They make me pose in front of my paintbrushes. They take me outdoors, more alive than indoors, put me in front of a staircase because a group of children is playing behind me. They notice a bench and immediately, what a windfall, make me sit down on it. as if the terrified photographer must exert himself to the utmost to keep the photograph from becoming death. But I, already an object, I do not struggle. I foresee that I shall have to wake from this bad dream even more uncomfortably. For what society makes of my photograph, what it reads there, I do not know. In any case, there are so many readings of the same face. But when I discover myself in the product of this operation, what I see is that I've become total image, which is to say, death in person. Others, the other, do not dispossess me of myself. They turn me ferociously into an object. They put me at their mercy, at their disposal, classified in a file, ready for the subtlest deceptions. One day an excellent photographer took my picture. I believed I could read in his image the distress of a recent bereavement. For once, photography had restored me to myself. But soon afterward, I was to find the same photograph on the cover of a pamphlet. By the artifice of printing, I no longer had anything but a horrible, disinternalized countenance, as sinister and repellent as the image the authors wanted to give of my language. The private life is nothing but that zone of space, of time, where I am not an image, an object. It is my political right to be a subject, which I must protect. Those of you out there who talk about objectification, the objectification of the female body, why don't you read stuff like this? This is actually drilling down on what objectification actually means. And you can start importing this into your other essays. And your instructors will be impressed, right? But it's not just about impressing them. It's about understanding more profoundly what is meant by objectification. This is what Barthes is giving us. Ultimately, next paragraph, what I'm seeking in the photograph taken of me, the intention according to which I look at it, is death. Death is the eidos, the essence of that photograph. Hence, strangely, the only thing that I tolerate, that I like, that is familiar to me when I'm photographed, is the sound of the camera. For me, the photographer's organ is not his eye, which terrifies me, but his finger. What is linked to the trigger of the lens, to the metallic shifting of the plates when the camera still has such things. I love these mechanical sounds in an almost voluptuous way, as if, in the photograph, they were the very thing and the only thing to which my desire clings. Their abrupt click breaking through the mortiferous layer of the pose. For me, the noise of time is not sad. I love bells, clocks, watches. And I recall that at first photographic implements were related to techniques of cabinet making and the machinery of precision. Cameras, in short, were clocks for seeing. And perhaps in me, someone very old still hears in the photographic mechanism the living sound of the wood. As spectators, we need language. We need to find a rhetoric to describe the effect that a photographic image has on us as spectators. We need to translate it. And many of the terms we can use to do that, you're already very familiar with, because you use these terms, or at least think about them, when you're photoshopping your stuff, your images at home. So, you know, we can talk about arrangement and the sort of composition of the different disparate elements inside the frame. We can talk about background and foreground. We can talk about different planes, vertical, horizontal planes. We can talk about the juxtaposition of elements inside the frame, correlations, montage effects, whatever, we can talk about the rule of thirds, which you're probably familiar with. So this is a sort of general law that seems to operate in the composition and arrangement of paintings and photographs, so that the eye is drawn to the main object across a third of inside the frame. So why don't I just show you? It's going to be much better, isn't it, if I just give you an example. There we are. So the idea is that you need to anchor the image, and you do that by placing it on this intersection of thirds, given the dimensions of the canvas overall. It's pleasing to the eye, but it also means that you now have a lot of negative space, sort of energy to work with creatively, sort of projecting outwards from that. There's another example for us here. And we can go back to the 18th century for, the first sort of definitions of this principle. Here we are. The rule of thirds was first written down by John Thomas Smith, 1797, in his book Remarks on Rural Scenery. And he quotes a 1783 work by Sir Joshua Reynolds, in which Reynolds discusses in unquantified terms the balance of dark and light in a painting. And Smith then continues with an expansion on this idea, naming it the rule of thirds. So two distinct equal lights should never appear in the same picture. One should be principal and the rest subordinate, both in dimension and degree. Unequal parts and gradations lead the attention easily from part to part, while parts of equal appearance hold it awkwardly suspended, as if unable to determine which of those parts is to be considered as the subordinate. And to give the utmost force and solidity to your work, some part of the picture should be as light and some as dark as possible, and these two extremes are then to be harmonized and reconciled to each other. As with most rules, this is the rule to be broken. But it's, well, is it surprising? I don't know. But in almost everything you look at, you will find any fixed image, shall we say, you're going to find this principle at work. So, okay, we can be talking about stuff like that. We can be talking about emphasis and clarity of the target, whatever it may be. So we might be using these elements that I just mentioned so as to emphasize the target. We can be using tone. There are different sort of palettes we can use to achieve that, different exposures, zoom elements. I mean, you get it, right? So I don't need to labor the point. These are the words we need to be using now when we start to describe what we're seeing in photographs or pictures. But Roland Barthes gives us another, some more terminology, which I think is going to be extremely helpful. So let's now look at that. So he says here, chapter 10, my rule was plausible enough for me to try to name these two elements whose co-presence established, it seemed, the particular interest I took in these photographs. The first, obviously, is an extent. It is the extension of a field, which I perceive quite familiarly as a consequence of my knowledge, my culture. And this field can be more or less stylized, more or less successful, depending on the photographer's skill or luck. But it always refers to a classical body of information. So the photograph that he's talking about here is these two. So these are by Cohen Vessing, and they were taken in 1979 in Nicaragua. And I will come back to these photographs in a minute, but let's just go back to what Bart is saying here. So we have in Nicaragua, he says, all the signs of, wretched, ununiformed soldiers, ruined streets, corpses, grief, the sun, and the heavy-lidded Indian eyes. Thousands of photographs consist of this field. And in these photographs, I can, of course, take a kind of general interest, one that is even stirred sometimes. But in regard to them, my emotion requires the rational intermediary of an ethical and political culture. What I feel about these photographs derives from an average affect, almost from a certain training. I did not know a French word which might account for this kind of human interest, but I believe the word exists in Latin. It is studium, which doesn't mean, at least not immediately, study, but application to a thing. Taste for someone, a kind of general enthusiastic commitment, of course, but without special acuity. It is by studium that I'm interested in so many photographs, whether I receive them as political testimony or enjoy them as good historical scenes. For it is culturally that I participate in these figures, the faces, the gestures, the settings, the actions. The second element will break or punctuate the studium. This time, it is not I who seek it out, as I invest the field of the studium with my consciousness, my sovereign consciousness. It is this element which rises from the scene, shoots out of it like an arrow and pierces me. A Latin word exists to designate this wound, this prick, this mark made by a pointed instrument. The word suits me all the better in that it also refers to the notion of punctuation. And because the photographs I'm speaking of are in effect punctuated, sometimes even speckled, with these sensitive points. Precisely these marks, these wounds, are so many points. This second element, which will disturb the studium, I shall therefore call punctum. For punctum is also sting, speck, cut, little hole, and also a cast of the dice. A photographer's punctum is that accident which pricks me, but also bruises me. It's poignant to me. Having thus distinguished two themes in photography, for in general the photographs I liked were constructed in the manner of a classical sonata, I could occupy myself with one after the other. Many photographs are, alas, inert under my gaze. But even among those which have some existence in my eyes, most provoke only a general and, so to speak, polite interest. They have no punctum in them. They please or displease me without pricking me. They are invested with no more than studium. The studium is that very wide field of unconcerned desire, of various interests, of inconsequential taste. I like, I don't like. The studium is of the order of liking, not of loving. It mobilizes a half desire, a demi-volition. It is the same sort of vague, slippery, irresponsible interest one takes in the people, the entertainments, the books, the clothes one finds all right. To recognize the studium is invariably to encounter the photographer's intentions, to enter into harmony with them, to approve or disapprove of them, but always to understand them, to argue them within myself. For culture, from which the studium derives, is a contract arrived at between creators and consumers. The studium is a kind of education, knowledge and civility, politeness, which allows me to discover the operator, to experience the intentions which establish and animate his practices, but to experience them in reverse, according to my will as a spectator. So what Bart is saying here is that most photographs for him are purely operating in in the sense of studium. And in that sense, they are banal. He uses the word elsewhere, unary. These are unary photographs. Most of the photographs you see are going to be unary, just studium. And you will interact with them in that sense. Only occasionally will a punctum pierce you. And very often, it's going to take time for that to happen. As he writes about it elsewhere, it's a process that sort of bubbles and percolates. It's almost like that encoded memory that is stored. Remember we talked about that? It's stored by being forgotten, and then it comes up to be decoded or retrieved. This is almost like punctum, I think, a way of describing it. It just kind of works in our minds, in our subconscious. There's something about the photograph that catches our eye, and we don't know why, and then we start to associate, and then we find something intriguing. So in the Vessing, Nicaragua photograph, the punctum for Bart is the woman holding holding the handkerchief to her nose here, which is suggestive of the repugnant smell of the decomposing body. In another photograph, it's a belt worn by the person who's posing in front of the camera. The studium is whatever from some historical context, but it's the belt buckle that works as the punctum for Bart, because it's exactly like the buckle that his grandmother used to wear. And so he's making that connection, almost Proustian in that sense, making a connection to something elsewhere. In this photograph of Tristan Tzara at the bottom here, the punctum is the dirty fingernails for Bart. Okay? Clearly not part of the studium. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do in your photographic report, digital assignment, whatever, which is not due until the last week of term, what I'm going to ask you to do is find a photograph, a famous photograph, or at least a photograph in the public domain, and analyze it using the terminology that we're picking up now. Not just the sort of elements that we talked about previously, but also studium and punctum, and in particular studium and punctum. I want you to explain to me how you have been pierced or pricked by some element in a photograph, unintended by the photographer as far as you're aware, but which has pricked you to make associations with something else in a way that you find revealing or interesting, which says something about your own state of mind. Now, that is probably a bit confusing at the moment, so it seems beholden on me to show you how this might work by taking you through a couple of photographs that have triggered a punctum in me. And we enter the realm here of something which is very subjective and personal, and sort of creative. So I hope you will bear with me on that. Now, of these two photographs here, which I first encountered in this book, it was this one below that captured my attention. And there was something about it that just kept lodging in my mind, even after I closed the book, and made me go back to it. And every time I kind of worked on the book, preparing for this course, I kept going back to this photograph, thinking, what is it? What is it? What is it? What is, I mean, I get the studium, I get everything that's intended here by the operator. We all do, right? We understand the tragedy and the horror of this. But there is something that captures my eye, and it is actually the pavement. I realized it's the pavement. It's this kind of fractured, broken up surface, but which at the same time suggests a pattern. And it was several days later. Um, in fact, it might be better if I can show you a photograph of this. Yeah, that's a bit better, isn't it? Clearer. So it was the kind of composition of these broken concrete pieces that made me draw a connection to this top photograph. Now, this takes me back to the early 90s when I was working on my graduate thesis. And it was morning television, GMTV in the UK. So I was kind of working all night, and then I would pour myself a very stiff drink and wander around the garden and then watch the news before going to bed. And this was GMTV, and they had a kind of weather section, of course, and this was their gimmicky way of doing it for a while. They had this model of the United Kingdom, which they put into this basin, marina or whatever it is. It might be in Birmingham, I'm not sure. And then the person presenting the weather would just wander around, up to Scotland or across to Ireland, jump across to Ireland and back again, and showing where the sun, and maybe have their umbrella up. It was just stupid, all right, but kind of. But this led me then to the woman who was doing the weather presentations back then, Ulrika Johnson, who you could tell was going on to bigger and better things than presenting the weather on some kind of plastic cutout of the UK. And indeed, that was the case. I mean, she was clearly, you could tell, intelligent and charismatic, and became a very big sort of TV celebrity for about 10, 15 years back in the UK. And still is. I think she's based in Sweden now and writes all sorts of journalistic articles, so on and so forth. So I'm sort of connecting images now. And I disappeared to Canada for many, many years to do my master's and graduate work and whatever. Went off into the law, got involved in all sorts of other things. And really, she did not appear back on my radar until I happened to come across a tabloid newspaper in the UK and saw this. Now, I was shocked, just as you are right now, because I wasn't quite sure what I was looking at. I mean, we are all immediately thinking Photoshop, right? We're thinking this can't be for real, but this was in a national newspaper, and you're thinking, well, what's going on here? And then there were multiple other images of her looking possibly ill in this sense, and we discover, I learned that there were issues with anorexia and other issues going on. It became very disturbing to me personally, not just because of the shift in image, but because of the sense in which I'm unable to feel secure about what I'm looking at, because I just don't know whether this is real or not. And going back to this original photograph here, I'm sort of piecing it all together, and it became for me a punctum that connected up images to do with fall and decline and mortality, the passing of time, and the sort of horror of that. The image of Ulrika Johnson at the end is almost like a living death image, which is exactly what Bart has been talking about. Remember, I read that piece at length about his feelings about being the target. about how it's a kind of deathly moribund feeling that something's been taken from you. It's almost as though this whole process is sketched out in my mind, triggered by this initial punctum. So for sure, yeah, this says something about me at the time I was doing this. I think one of the things that was occupying my mind increasingly is the epistemological crisis we find ourselves in, increasingly unsure of what we're looking at in a world of fake news or alleged fake news and deep fake videos. What can be relied upon anymore? And so it is that this whole chain comes together, but it was triggered by the punctum. That's the point. Now, a much shorter example, another one. And this takes me to this photograph here at the top. This photograph was actually taken by Lee Miller. There she is. Now, she is an extraordinary woman. She was a Vogue model in the 30s and 40s, but then became a war correspondent. And in 1945, she traveled to Germany, got permission to travel around Germany, taking photographs and writing also of what she saw right at the end of the Second World War. And one of the photographs she took was of these two guys. It's a clearer photograph, which is a truly disturbing image. These were former SS concentration camp guards who, obviously dressed in this way to try and escape, were captured and beaten up. And you can see that there they are, incarcerated. Now, the studium here, I think, is pretty clear. It's everything that I just said. I mean, it's what you now take from this photograph. Its context. We see the tragedy of it. But there was something about the guy on the right and his coat which operated like a punctum to me, triggered something, pierced something, connecting to something outside of this photograph. And again, I wasn't sure what it was. It took a while for me to connect things up. But eventually I did, and I ended up with actually a comedy sketch, which was the Marx Brothers. And there's a very famous sketch in one of their films where they're all piling into a ship's cabin. I'll send it to you as a clip. It's actually quite funny. But for me, the character that I'm connecting with is Harpo Marx. This is the Marx Brothers. The coat here that Groucho was wearing is very similar to the coat worn by the prisoner. And it's the face, the face here on the right of Harpo, and the hair, and he's kind of got ferocious kind of jaw. There's another picture of him there. Yeah. And from that awful, tragic photograph, I'm now looking at comedy scenes. I'm making that sort of connection here. So sometimes punctum takes you in places you don't want to go. You think you ought not to go, but you can't help it. It just takes you there, right? And so one of the things I want you to understand is that punctum operates here. It can be associative. You can find it in the interstices and the spaces between things. It's to do with correlations, juxtapositions. It's image clusters. All right, that's kind of what's happening. Images clustering upon other images. It's like a journey they take you on. And here, I guess I'm looking at the hair, the coat, and the confined space, the shape of the man's face, the jaw, the hair, and I arrive at the Marx Brothers. And the tragicomic dimension of this now, in my mind, triggered by this punctum, also connects with what I was reading at the time. Because I was reading a book by Hannah Arendt on Adolf Eichmann, who was in charge of whatever concentration camps during the Second World War and fled to Argentina, I think. He was captured and taken back to Israel, where he was put on trial. And she was there as a kind of journalist writer. And one of the phrases that she uses to describe him and other people who were running the German war machine was the banality of evil. It's a phrase that's quite famous now and is associated with Arendt's work, because this is what struck her more than anything else about these monsters, how ordinary they were. These were not brilliant, clever men, of great directing intelligence. These were butcher, baker, candlestick maker guys, just truly ordinary guys. There was something terribly simple and banal about them, but that's what she found so terrifying at the same time. And I look at these two figures here, and in particular the one on the right, at least for me, for you it may be the other guy, but for me it's this guy. And I'm seeing brutality here, what they were as concentration camp guards, what they are as now victims of violence. I'm seeing this dressed up almost comically in the guise of a waiter, almost a concert pianist, the way he's dressed with his jacket. I'm looking at the banality of evil. That's it for me. So there we are. This is kind of what I want you to be doing, please, with whatever photograph you decide to talk about. Take me on a journey and tell me your thoughts and feelings about it. I guess it would help if I actually showed you the assignment. Although maybe I'm going to do that in a moment, because what I want to do now is just talk a bit more about how Barthes talks about the element of time in punctums. So, as he says, the punctum is what is added to the photograph after it's been taken, but it's also what is already there. And that's why, well, first thing to say, that's why we need to be focusing and looking at photographs, actual photographs, and not videos or films. Why? Because if you're watching a movie or a video, you don't have time for a punctum to form, do you? Right? You don't even have time to close your eyes, because every image is just followed by the next. And similarly, in a photograph, you have a target posing, fixed, and in position. Whereas in a film reel or video, there's no pose. Each pose is very, automatically sort of pushing into the next. So this is why in talking about this, we need to be looking at fixed images and photographs. And in respect of the passing of time, or the activity of time here, there's a wonderful quote from Susan Sontag and her book on photography, another brilliant book to read. She says that the subject of the photograph is touching us like the delayed rays of a star. So now, this photograph here at the bottom is in Barthes' book. This is of Louis Hine, who was executed in 1865, having attempted to assassinate the US Secretary of State. The studium of the photograph, says Barthes, is everything we kind of take from it as intended by the operator. So we have this look at defiance, rebelliousness, perhaps vanity, slightly aggressive. We have a look of incarceration. And we have the political context if we know about what he tried to do and the social activism behind all of that. So, that's the studium of the photograph. But for Barth, the punctum is that he's about to die. Or rather, as Barth puts it, this will be and this has been. Death in the future, this is what pricks me, says Barth of this photograph. And this punctum of time is to be found in most historical photographs, says Barth, or many of them, although it will work upon us differently depending upon our moods and how we react. But he says there is always a defeat of time in these photographs. There is dead and there is going to die. It's almost like a time slip, right? It's a visual time slip. And within it contains very often a pathos too. It moves us. That notion of time slip moves us. These two photographs here are by Kurtz. And they're used by Barth to sort of demonstrate pathos flowing from this time punctum, this sense that we're looking at characters who've long passed, and yet there they are looking at us in their youth and their innocence, with all their future ahead of them. The first one I had to give to you because he's called Ernest. Absolutely lovely. And I'm already looking at the girl behind him. You see, I'm just getting it now, this kind of punctum feel of it from that girl behind him, and it's making me make associations, and I'm not quite sure yet where that's going. It's funny, I just realized that. And the one at the bottom, boy with puppy. Don't know whether that's posed or how deliberately it's posed. It's such a ferocious look of jealousy and protectiveness and love. So these two photographs may not do anything to you, but they did in particular ways for Barth contain a punctum, and that's why he wrote about them. All right, let's just look at this assignment now. So this is worth, I think, 20%. Let's have a look. Yeah, so photographic journal presentation, 20%. And I think it's due, towards the end of term, so don't worry about it. I'll give you the exact date in the email. So I want you to choose a photograph or a set of photographs and analyze it in front of the class, although you're going to be doing it by a digital PowerPoint, however you want to do it, but you're going to send it to my email. Using the terms we've learned for interpreting photographs. In particular, it should raise for you a punctum that you can explain. So your presentation will take the form of your showing the image or images, explaining the context and composition of the photograph as you see it, as well as how you came across it and why, with perhaps some information about the studium of the image, its general intention or field, and then an explanation of how the punctum has triggered in you some associations that you recall and which are particularly significant to you. The punctum can, in this way, take you to other images that you want to show. Text, music, whatever, right? Anything that illustrates how and why the photograph is particularly significant to you. So, for reasons that I've explained, you need to be analyzing a photograph and not a video or moving film. It must be in the general domain. A famous photograph or photograph taken of a well-known event. And you might find it helpful to do some research on it so that you can tell us what others have seen in the photograph and perhaps what the photographer operator themselves were thinking, and how and why your interpretation has gone off in an unintended direction. So we don't back away from controversy in this class, and your photograph can be provocative and challenging. Obviously, we avoid images that are gratuitously pornographic or violent, and you can always run something past me if you need to. All right, and I'm looking for about 5 minutes in total for this presentation. Okay, now, if we turn to the literary treatment of photography, it's really not until the mid-20th century, in fact, the 60s and 70s, that writers start writing about the photographic process as we've been discussing it in terms of these subject positions. I mean, of course, you have photographs featuring in fiction beforehand. I mean, there's Agatha Christie's Mrs. McGinty's Dead. I think in Chekhov's The Three Sisters, one of the characters, Fedotov, is continually taking photographs of relatives. In James Joyce's Ulysses, Molly Bloom actually takes up photography, right? So it's not like it's not mentioned or appears, but it's not analyzed in a literary way until probably the 60s, 70s. And so this now is going to constitute the rest of the course, because the 4 short stories we are going to be reading are analyzing what it is to be an operator or a target or a spectator. In fact, everything is illuminated. This novel that we're arriving at explores all 3 quite profoundly, I think. And this takes me to the first story I want us to read by Raymond Carver, called Viewfinder. And I'm going to ask you to read that now, please, if you haven't already. As with most good, well-written short stories, it all kicks off at the beginning. Things should be bouncing around. So much of what happens should already be suggested in the opening few lines. Very Edgar Allan Poe, right? Viewfinder. Already this is intriguing as a title. View of what? In command of whom and why? There's actually something ironically obscure about that title, at least at the moment. And then this: a man without hands came to the door to sell me a photograph of my house. No name. None of these characters have names. Except for the chrome hooks, he was an ordinary looking man of 50 or so. What does this tell us about the narrator? Already. He is almost cruelly ironic. And the first thing he says to him is, "How did you lose your hands?" Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody comes to the door without hands, that's the absolute last bloody thing I'm going to mention. I'm going to be looking everywhere else. I'm not going to ask them that question. Now, maybe that's bad in another way, but this is remarkably forthright, borderline aggressive, right? And it kind of immediately sets the tone of how these guys are going to interact with each other, because they barely do. It's like they talk past each other. We've got the problem of, how does a guy take photographs if he's only got hooks? Well, that seems to be solved towards the bottom here. But in the mind of the narrator, there are all sorts of problems here. How is he going to hold a cup of coffee? I'm going to watch him do that. Yeah, so it's almost voyeuristic is the word. And this business about Jello is quite a cruel joke. The dialogue, such as it is truncated, short, chipped, clipped, I should say, forced. They're almost talking past each other. But in a kind of playful, ironic way, the narrator is hooked, just as we are hooked. I talk to my English 100 students about hooks in rhetoric and how we should introduce them into our writing. It's how you keep the reader alert and interested and provoke the reader. Well, Carver is doing that playfully with these hooks. And so it is that the narrator is hooked here into going along with this project of having photographs taken of him. But we've already got a confirmation of the voyeuristic nature of the narrator in the second page, 250, about 7-8 lines down. Oh no, sorry, for at the end of this section at the top, I've been watching from the window, you see. So we have this idea of I'm watching you watching me. It's a kind of self-reflexive process. It gets stranger and stranger. We have references to family, a fragmented family. Both of these guys, it seems, are alone, alienated, cut off, angry. There's a very bizarre statement here where the camera guy says, they were talking about, I had kids once, just like you. I waited with the cups and watched him struggle up from the sofa. He doesn't offer to help him get up from the sofa. He's just watching him. He said, there, what gave me this? I took a good look at those hooks. How? Isn't that just puzzling too? How did his kids give him hooks? Hands that are missing. Or is he saying that I've got to work and do anything I can because I've got kids? In other words, they've hooked me into doing this. I don't know. It's just increasingly weird. So now we have the agreements, the contract that photographs will be taken. So we have an operator, the guy with the hooks, who's taking photographs of a target on the narrator. And of course, we are now spectators on this scene. But as we move down this page and go to the end, we find that the narrator starts to shift and take control of the situation. He demands that the photographs be taken with him standing on the roof, and he's posing and he's performing, he's acting out, and then he picks up some rocks and he starts throwing them. It was, when I saw them, the rocks, it was like a little rock nest screen over the chimney hole. Ready, I called, and I got a rock, and I waited until he had me in his viewfinder. Okay, he called. I laid back my arm and I hollered, now! I threw that son of a bitch as far as I could throw it. I don't know, I heard him shout, I don't do motion shots. Again, I screamed and took up another rock. It was a very alarming image. We almost have this primitive man at the top of the house just throwing rocks at God knows what or whom. Quite altogether disturbing. Now, okay, what do we do with this story? What's it about, generally speaking? You have your own interpretations, of course. That's great. And you'll have an opportunity to tell me about those. All I can do is kind of give you how I'm seeing it. And I see this story as very much to do with the power of photography. That's what it's about. The power of the lens. Not necessarily a good thing, but I think that's what Carver is exploring here. Its capacity, the photographic process, shall we say, to empower subjects, people. I mean, what we've got here is two guys who are emotionally stunted, damaged, suffering, desperately lonely, who are able, it seems somehow, to find some sort of communion mediated by the photographic process. And it becomes a metaphor or an expression for their pain, particularly the narrator. So yeah, generally speaking, this is a story about the power of photography. But then I think it kicks off in two different directions, at least it does in my mind. In one reading, it's as though the narrator is challenging all those insecurities and problems that Bart talks about being the target, all those discomforting feelings one has about being the target of a photograph. But this guy in this story seems to love it, right? I mean, it seems to empower him. It's as though he's a nobody at the beginning of the story, a hollow absence of a man who becomes empowered as he becomes the target. It's almost as though target for him doesn't mean target. It means he's now important. He is now framed. He is now somebody. His life is now significant. So you could say that as a result of this process, we have something empowering and therapeutic for this guy, and possibly for the guy with the hooks too. So that's one reading. But I have another reading, which is to do with us as spectators now of this scene in front of us. And what we witness, I think, is a narrator who starts as a spectator, kind of looking out of the window, who becomes conventional target of a photograph taken by someone else, but who then actually shifts into an operator position, because he's actually calling the shots at the end. It's almost as though he's operating the camera at the end. It's as though these positions have conflated as he stands there on the roof in that guise. But as spectators, we look at this and think, holy shit, you know, the more he progresses on this sort of chain, the more he shifts through these different positions, the more vain, the more narcissistic he becomes, the more aggressive, the more cynical, the more angry, and the more dangerous and the more threatening he becomes. And for God's sake, this is very disturbing, isn't it, at the end? Or it's very funny. Let's say it's up to you how you read it, right? But so in other words, I think it's a clever story, because yes, generally it's about the power of photography, but it's also opening up these different readings for us, depending upon our own readings of the story. Okay, so in the next video, we'll look at another terrific story, I think, by Italo Calvino, called The Adventures of a Photographer. And it will take us much deeper into the psychological issues that Calvino associates with being the operator in this process. So that's where we're heading next. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you in the next video.